What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at a really intense game played between Magnus Carlsen and his new rival Alireza Firouzja in the 2025 Julius Baer Cup. This game was very intense. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Magnus Carlsen opening one, knight f3, the ready opening, and here Alireza, he goes one, knight f6 as well. Now we have the move 2 g3, heading for a King's Indian attack setup with the moves bishop g2 and short castles. And here, once again, Alireza, he continues metering white and goes g6 himself. Now Magnus is getting pretty annoyed so far with this by Alireza, and he does go b3, heading for a double fianchetto setup with those bishops going to g2 and b2. And again, he is trying his best to break the symmetry, and finally Alireza, he does oblige. He goes bishop g7, and we finally have an imbalanced position on the board. Now we have bishop b2, d6, bishop g2, as promised, Magnus getting both those bishops on b2 and g2, and now here, Alireza, very interestingly, he seizes control of the center of the board with the very strong, very precise move e5, bang, gaining control and threatening e4. Now, of course, white has to go d3 to guard that e4 square, d3 played in the game. Now, if black goes e4, white can capture that pawn, and he will be doing just fine. Now, here black does castle. Again, very importantly, if black goes e4, then white can take on e4, and you can't capture that pawn with the knight, as then you hang the bishop on g7. That is a very simple but very important tactical idea. So instead, short castles played in the game, and now we have the move c4 in the spirit of the English opening, and now it is very clear white will be playing on the queen side, black in the center of the board, and on the king side. It will be a very interesting game from here. Now, Alireza, how does he want to continue? Normally, you would expect, say, I don't know, c6, knight d7, and so on, but instead, the move a5 was played in the game, immediately seizing control on the queen side and threatening the move a4. The idea being, you potentially want to open up the a file for your rook on a8, and beyond that, you potentially want to go a4 and then a3 later in the game if this knight moves off the b1 square in the spirit of Alpha Zero, trying to get the very strong pawn wedge on the a3 square. Now here, white continues, knight c3, guarding that a4 square. Now if black goes a4, you recapture the pawn with the knight immediately, stopping it dead in its tracks. Now here, black goes h6, guarding that g5 square. Now we have short castles, and then c6, guarding d5, potentially setting up d5 ideas. But overall here, black, his main idea is just to go perhaps bishop b6, queen d7, maybe queen c7, knight d7, and so on, in the spirit of the fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defense. And again, rather than a fast d5, black is most likely to continue developing and staying relatively flexible with his pawn structure in the center of the board. Now here, white, how does he want to continue? Well, he has a few main ideas. You can go e4, you can go d4, or you can continue developing, staying flexible with your pawns. Now, in the game, e4 was chosen by the GOAT, gaining space in the center and transitioning immediately to some sort of fianchetto variation of the King's Indian defense. Of course, white has both bishops fianchettoed on g2 and b2. Now, black continues, rook to e8. We have rook e1, both rooks lining up on the e-file, anticipating that d4 break, at which point the e-file will be a semi-open e-file. Now we have knight a6, perhaps intending knight c5. That would be a very good square for the knight overall. And now white goes h3, guarding g4 before going d4. It's a very typical idea, again, in the fianchetto King's Indian defense. Now here, black has a wide variety of ways to continue. For example, you can go knight c5, jumping in with the knight. You can go h5, threatening h4 ideas. You can go knight h7, threatening knight g5 ideas. And finally, you can go bishop d7, as chosen in the game by Alireza. And I quite like this idea. The idea being, you want to go queen c8, pressuring that pawn on h3, and overall continuing to develop while staying very flexible with your pieces. Now here, Magnus, he decides it is time to break in the center of the board. He goes d4, gaining space, and Magnus here should have at least a small advantage out of the opening. Overall, this is a relatively good version of a fianchetto King's Indian defense. Now we have e takes d4, then knight takes d4, and then knight c5. The knight jumping into the very good c5 square, and again, it's going to be very hard for white to challenge that knight on c5. The only real way to do it is to go a3 and then b4, but that would weaken the queen side considerably. Now here, instead, white continues, queen c2, bolstering that pawn on e4. Now that pawn is supported 1, 2, 3, 4 times by the knight, queen, rook, and bishop. And that means black is going to have a very hard time winning that pawn on e4 anytime soon. Now here again, black has a wide variety of ways to continue, but in the game, Alireza, he continues down the path set by bishop d7 on the 2 moves prior. He goes queen to c8, pressuring that pawn on h3. Obviously, white is going to have to defend. He goes king to h2, a very typical thematic move, defending that pawn on h2, or h3, sorry, with the bishop and the king. And here, Alireza, he busts out an absolutely insane-looking move, at least at first glance, but overall, it is very thematic for the king's Indian defense. He goes knight g4, jumping up with the knight and opening up the discovered attack of the bishop on the knight on d4. Now, of course, if white takes on g4, black takes on d4, and overall, black is doing relatively okay. But again, this move was not completely necessary. You could go, say, queen to c7 or a4 or any other number of moves here in this position. But instead, Alireza, being the very flashy player that he is, knight g4 played in the game. You gotta love it. Now here, Magnus, he is up for the challenge. He goes h takes g4, winning back that knight, then bishop takes d4, flying in with the bishop, then rook a d1, pressuring the bishop with the rook. Where is the bishop going to go? It goes bishop g7, simply retreating. Now we have f3, white bolstering all of those weak pawns in the center of the board and the king side. Of course, that pawn on g4 was under attack by the bishop on d7. Therefore, f3 does bolster that pawn on g4. Now we have to move queen to c7, getting the queen off the back rank, a perfectly fine move. And now white makes a little bit of mistake. It turns out here, the strongest continuation is knight to e2, opening up the attack of the bishop on b2 on the one on g7. And of course, if that g7 bishop does come off the board, that would certainly be to white's benefit, as that bishop is just so important in terms of defending the black king side. Now, instead, queen d2 played in the game, and again, this move misses the opportunity to go knight to e2, and here black is going to have decent chances. All right, bishop e6 chosen in the game, pressuring c4, pressuring the d5 square, and potentially setting up d5 ideas from black. Now, white does go knight to e2, but it turns out this is one move too late. Again, here, if black goes bishop takes b2, then white is effectively losing a tempo, going to d2 with the queen, and then back to b2. Now here, how should Alireza proceed? Well, it turns out bishop takes b2 immediately is the strong continuation for black. However, instead, rook e d8 chosen in the game, bolstering the pawn on d6. That pawn was being attacked by the queen and the rook, so this move makes some sense. But here, Magnus, as usual, finds the right way to proceed. He takes the bishop, bishop takes g7, then king takes, then queen to c3, targeting that king on g7. Now we have the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack to defend. The move f6 played in the game, blocking that long diagonal. And now we have rook d2 for Magnus, simply intending rook e d1, doubling up pressure, doubling up those rooks on the d file, and pressuring d6. Now we have queen to e7, centralizing the queen, rook e d1. And here, Alireza, he's got to find a plan. He really isn't doing anything that active so far in the position. And if he sits around and waits, sooner or later, white's going to go b3, then a3, then b4, maybe f4, then e5 or f5, and so on. Like, you give white enough time in this position, he will slowly but surely increase the pressure, and therefore black really has to find some sort of way to get counterplay here. Now, what are black's options? In the game, bishop f7 was chosen. However, there were other ideas, including queen c7 and a4. a4 perhaps being the one I like the most, as you are trying to open up the a file and trying to get some sort of counterplay going on the queen side. Instead, bishop f7 chosen in the game. Now Magnus, knight d4, jumping up with the knight. Of course, bishop f7 was designed to get out of the way of the attack of knight d4 preemptively. And now what is black going to do? He goes rook d7, getting his rook off the back rank, potentially intending rook d8 or rook e8 ideas next. Now here, Magnus, he decides it is time to turn up the heat. And I'm going to be honest, this move right here by Magnus, I am not so sure about it, but he plays plays it anyway. He goes for the move f4, gaining space on the king side and making that pawn on e4 very vulnerable. What is the idea? If you take on e4 with the knight, then white is simply going to go bishop takes e4, queen takes, then rook e2. For example, knight takes is a mistake. That deserves 2 question marks here. Then bishop takes, queen takes, and rook to e2. And look at this. The queen is literally trapped. Every square on the e file covered by the rook, f5 and d5 covered. Also f3 and g2 and h1 covered by the king and the knight on d4. Therefore, overall, you cannot take that pawn on e4, and that is the tactical justification for that move f4. However, overall, this move f4 does permanently weaken these pawns in the center and on the king side, and white is going to have to follow up very precisely to justify this move, which may in fact be premature. All right, black continues, king g8, getting his king off this diagonal where it was exposed to the white queen on c3. Now we have the move rook e2, defending that pawn once and for all. And now here, Alireza, he does gain space on the queen side with the move a4. And this move, at first glance, does look reasonably strong. I mean, I was praising this move earlier in this video. However, here, I do want to point out, in this position, it wasn't necessarily the strongest idea, and white finds the very simple tactical response, b4, driving back that knight on b5, if I could draw arrows correctly with that pawn. And now what is black going to do? Well, according to the engine, you actually don't need to move that knight yet, and the strongest move here is the move a3, the alpha 0 advance, gaining space on the queen side. The idea being, if you take on c5, black takes back on c5, and now the knight on d4 is pinned to the rook on the d1 square because these rooks are not connected. So that would be the strongest way forward. Instead, in the game, knight a6 chosen by Alireza, retreating the knight and putting more pressure on b4 with it. Now white continues, b5. Now we have c takes b5, and here white can recapture with the c pawn or the knight. In the game, knight takes b5 chosen, and they're both approximately equally good, so don't worry about it too much. Here black continues, rook c8, piling up pressure on that pawn on c4. Now, of course, the threat is simply rook takes c4, winning that pawn on the c4 square and driving away that queen on c3. And where would it go? Here white continues, rook e d2, piling up pressure on the weak pawn on d6. Now we have rook takes c4, flying in with the rook, queen to e3, sliding the queen over. Of course, there were better squares for the queen, including a1 and f3, but instead, e3 chosen in the game, a decent square. And here Alireza, he decides it is time to blow open the center of the board, d5 chosen. And again, look at all of these lines and files that will be blown open in very short order. All right, what should white be doing here? Well, first of all, that pawn on e4 is pinned. If you take on d5, e takes d5, that would be a massive mistake, as you literally lose the entire queen and the entire game on the spot. So overall, you cannot do that. Instead, if you go e5 here, then black will be relatively fine, as Magnus did in the game. Then black continues knight c7 as he did, and here black is doing relatively okay. He's chasing back that knight on b5, the pawn on e5 is relatively vulnerable, and suddenly most of white's advantage has evaporated in this game. All right, Magnus continues, knight takes c7, then rook takes c7, and then bishop takes d5. Then we have bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, and then queen to e6. Simply moving one square forward with the queen, pressuring the rook on d5, and now we officially have a queen and rook endgame. Both sides have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns apiece. It is going to be an all-out dogfight from here to see who the winner will be. But of course, Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, he will likely be the favored one in this endgame. All right, queen d3 chosen, sliding over with the queen. Now, of course, the problem with this move, it gives up the defense of the pawn on g4, and here black, he decides it is time to take it. He goes queen takes g4. However, this is a major mistake. Instead, you had to go f takes e5 here, capturing with that Ben Feingold f6 pawn. Instead, queen takes g4 chosen in the game. Now we have e6. This is the problem with the move queen takes g4. The pawn advances. And yes, that pawn can be taken by the queen, but if you take that, you give up the defense of the pawn on g6. White takes there, then threatens rook d8. For example, queen takes would be a mistake, then queen takes g6, followed by rook d8 would be deadly. So you can't do that. Instead, rook g7 chosen in the game, defending g6 and renewing the attack on the pawn on e6. But here, white just goes f5, the key follow-up. What is the idea? Obviously, if you advance the pawn, then your pawn on e6 will be defended forever. On the other hand, if you take on f5, as Alireza did in the game, then you just go rook d8, hit the king, drive back the king, then he goes rook d7, pinning the rook to the king. Of course, if you take the rook, you recapture with the e pawn, e takes d7, that pawn would be one square away from promoting. I mean, white would be borderline ready to win the game. So obviously, rook takes d7 is not a viable response. Instead, queen h5 hits the king. Then we have king g2, then queen g6. Now here, Magnus decides it is time to trade rooks. Rook takes g7, and now queen takes g7, and then queen to d7, pinning the queen on g7 to the king on h7. This is not looking good. Obviously, if black takes on d7, white recaptures with the pawn, and that pawn promotes instantly. Therefore, he has to find counterplay elsewhere. f4 chosen in the game. Now, that pawn on g3 is pinned to the king by the queen on g7. You can't take the pawn, so what's he going to do? In the game, g4 chosen. Of course, you can't take the pawn on g4, as then you lose the king on h7. That would not be a legal move, but Alireza, he continues f5, again renewing the threat, this time of f takes g4. What does Magnus do? He doesn't take on g7. Instead he goes e7, driving the pawn. The threat being e8 or queen to d8, followed by e8 again. Now black goes queen takes g4. The queen on g7 no longer being pinned to the king. However, I do want to point out, if it is white's turn to move and he's not in check, white just goes e8, promoting to a queen, and that would literally be checkmate on the spot. The back rank's covered, the 7th rank's covered, and the g6 square is covered by the new queen. So black here is one move away from getting checkmated. All right, white goes king to f2, then queen g3 chases the king, king to e2, f3 hits the king, king e3, f2 check, king e2, queen e5, and from here, the great king chase has begun. Again, black is literally one move away from getting checkmated. The checks continue. King takes f2, queen f4, king e2. We're going to fast forward a little bit here. Alireza doing everything he can to continue checking the white king. He chases the king literally all over the board. Magnus keeps running. This really happened. The king keeps running. It keeps running. It keeps running. It keeps running. And here, finally, in this position, Magnus just goes queen to c7, and get a load of this. He is virtually out of checks. Yes, he can go queen h8, but then Magnus goes king takes b7, and again, that pawn on e7 is about to promote to a queen. For example, queen h8, king takes b7, and now e8 promoted to a queen is a real threat, as the king would be under check once again. And in fact, this would be checkmate on the spot, and there is nothing black can do to stop it. If he goes queen to e8, queen d8, defends the pawn, forces the trade of queens, and so on. And in this position, Alireza Firouzja resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. There is simply nothing he can do to delay the inevitable. If he goes, say, queen to h8, white just goes queen d8, defending against the check. And again, that pawn on e7 is going to promote on the next move. So wow, what a game between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja in the 2024 Julius Baer Cup, which took place in October of that year. Very incredible stuff. Comment down below in terms of what you thought of this game between Magnus and Alireza. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Alireza action, check out this video right here, where I cover yet another one of their best games. So check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.